Hey everyone, it is Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Welcome to this Communications Network webinar. Hopefully you're in the right spot. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in just a quick minute. But before we do that, if you've been with us before, you know this is something we've made part of our practice for the last couple of years. And that is this idea of a two-word check-in, something we borrow from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston. If you would, go ahead into the chat. You should see that. It's got a little word bubble. You're familiar with that from living the Zoom life. Look and make sure you're talking to everyone, or it might say all panelists and attendees. And then if you would, type in your name, where you are coming in from. There's about 550 some of us registered for this thing today. And then in 2 words, how you doing? And once you've got that typed in, I'm going to say go in just a quick second. I'll model what it looks like right here. All right. Go ahead. Let's go ahead and see who's with us today. Hopefully we'll see some familiar faces as folks are coming into the room. Why don't we go ahead and move ahead? I got a couple pieces of housekeeping while I stick my specs in my eye, just to share with you a couple things you might know. One is we have a free listserv. And so chances are you have seen that at some point or another. There's hundreds of us gathering there every day, asking questions, sharing information and resources. And so encourage you all to avail yourselves of that. You do not need to be a network member to take advantage. It's a Google group. Information is right there. And we will, as we get the chat online, try to put in a chat's working now. So let's go back to this, gang. 2 words, your name, James down in Atlanta. How you doing, James? You can throw that in there as well. Sherry in Detroit, doing well. Glad to see it. Aaron in Virginia. Scott in Portland. Who else? Paula in Casper, Wyoming. Y'all had a big election out there. Lisa in PDX. PDX is Portland, is that right? Oh boy. Okay, going way too fast for me. As you can see, quite a number of folks in the room with us. We are happy and glad to have all of you with us. Again, I'm just going to keep yapping at you while you guys are saying hello to one another. Tristan, or rather Kareem, if you could take this forward from the listserv, we've got that. And the other thing I want to tell you about is this, the newsletter. This comes out every single month. You need to let us know that you want it. You got to register for this. Go to comnetwork.org and just hit subscribe, put in your email, and we'll send this to you once a month. It's a roundup of all the things we're doing at the network, and then some things that we think if you work in the field of comms for good that you should be aware of. We also post up some jobs, some other good stuff there. So with that, Mr. K, if you would, take us forward. First one's going to be Circles. This is a program we started early in the pandemic. Basic conceit is the network's over 3,000 people now from around the globe. Sometimes that feels like looking for a needle in a haystack when you're trying to find the exact right person who can help you with your work. So we started these circles. The idea is helping people connect based on either the job you do, maybe the issue you work on, or perhaps an identity that you share. And you can see a sample of some of the circles we've had going now. They're fantastic. They meet monthly by Zoom, chance to kind of break bread and chit chat with your colleagues. And also there's a Slack channel that's available to you 24/7. So if you have that question that's burning on a Tuesday afternoon, chances are one of your friends in that circle is going to be able to help you or steer you in the right direction. If you would, Kareem, take us forward. The other thing we've been doing, which we're real proud of, is locals. And this is groups of folks in the network. Don't have to be a network member to participate, but we certainly are grateful if you are. And you can kind of get a sense from this map about where folks are at. But the idea is we've been doing this virtually, although starting to creep back into in real life gatherings. Our friends in Denver, or I think Portland rather, are hosting one tomorrow. But the idea is, again, getting to know folks who live in your backyard who are doing similar kinds of work. The network is wonderful in allowing you to sort of leap across the country or across the ocean to talk to lots of great, wonderful folks, as you can see here in the chat. But sometimes you just need to borrow a cup of sugar, and it's easier to walk down the block to do that. That's kind of what locals are all about. You can learn about the locals at comnetwork.org, and we'll put that in the chat as well. Kareem, if you'll take us forward one more time. As I just said, Portland had to reschedule because it was beastly hot up there. Hopefully temperatures coming back closer to normal, what they're used to. But they're going to be gathering tomorrow. And there's some of the lovely faces you will see when you go out to visit with them if you're in the Portland, Oregon, not Portland, Maine, Portland, Oregon area. All right, if you would, Kareem, one more, I think. And that is it. We have another webinar coming up. We did a fantastic webinar with our friend Jenny Field. She is going to be coming back for part 2, talking about internal communications. We'll be sending you all an invitation to that. That's going to be a little bit later. I was going to say this month, but I guess we're still in August. So in September, we'll be sending a note about this to join us. And we're going to hear specifically from our friends at the San Francisco Foundation, who spent a ton of time thinking about how to communicate and how to get themselves aligned in the middle of the pandemic. They've gotten a lot better at it, and they're going to share what they've learned. I think that gets us to the finish line, in which case, Kareem, let me see if I'm right. Oh, one more thing, a little bit of bad news for those of you who maybe enjoyed a fabulous summer, but as a consequence, didn't get a ticket to ComNet. We are sold out. If you're one of those great folks who's on the wait list, there's about 100 and some folks on the wait list right now. If we haven't sent you an invitation, I'm afraid we're going to close the wait list and all registrations tomorrow. So if you haven't heard an invitation from us, I'm afraid we're going to have to tell you we'll see you next year. But the good news is we struck a partnership with our friends at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and all of the main stage sessions that we'll be hosting in Seattle will be available live, streaming at the Chronicle's website. That's philanthropy.com. We'll also, of course, as we always do, make a point of recording all of those and having those up on the network's YouTube channel. And that will be available, probably give us a couple days, but within a week or so of the conference concluding. So April 13th and 14th, if you're not able to be with us, you can be virtually through the Chronicle. We're also, for all those other sessions that won't be filmed, those breakout sessions and the like, we'll be taking notes. And so we'll post those up on comnetwork.org, certainly by November. So while we'll miss you, we will be taking all the content and knowledge and information that we're generating together and making sure everybody has access to it, because that's our mission and our goal. All right, with that, I think I can stop, other than to say thank you to Kenya. Oh, sorry, one more, my bad. We're talking about DEI today, so we want to make sure you all knew about this resource that we have, which is something that we, with the help of Niiobli and Samia and a number of other really talented, good folks in the network's DEI working group, came up with this site, ComNetwork DEI. It's got case studies. It's got some tools and resources for you to think about how you're doing your practice on the daily. It has a glossary and a bunch of other things that you can explore that help you bring the values of diversity, equity, inclusion to life and into action and into practice every day in your work. So I encourage you to check that out, please. With that, I think I'm finally done, other than to say thank you to Kenya, who is offering us ASL services. You will see me on the other side. You can pin Kenya if you have need for her help. You can also, I believe we've enabled a live transcript. There's a CC down at the bottom if you should need that. And then finally, invite you, stick around if you can. At the end of the hour, we're going to be doing something we call office hours. And so we'll send a link into the chat that'll invite everybody to come join us. We'll put aside 30 more minutes for you to chat with directly with Niiobli and Samia. So if you have the time and you'd like to join us, you have a very specific question, we'd love to have you do that. So we'll see you on the other side. With that, I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone and hand it over to Niiobli and Samia. Super grateful to them for being with us. Why don't y'all take it away? Thanks much, gang, for being with us.
Thank you, Sean. Glad to be back with this network. Good afternoon, everyone. Hold on to your chairs or seats. We want to have a very lively discussion today about a topic that is ever important. First and foremost, my name is Niiobli, Armah IV, he, him. I'm the founder and principal of We-Collab. I'm joined in the discussion today with Samia Mirza, our manager director, and we're both coming to you from Houston, Texas, which is the indigenous land of the Kokisha tribe, which was in the Galveston Bay area. We-Collab, we're a strategic equity firm. We are a one-song band. We help our partners, our clients, foundations create actionable and transformative solutions to impact Black and Brown, Indigenous, and communities of color writ large. And so I said, hold on to your chair. There's all different ways for you to engage with us today, but let's get started. Samia, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Awesome, wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're here to have a dialogue about the state of the field for equity work, really from 2020 until now, and then how we want it to evolve, what we want it to look like in the future. Specifically, we're going to cover how do we continue to have constructive conversations about race, equity, and strategy, even when it's no longer headline news. Second, we're going to talk about equity shouldn't be political. How do we elevate it above the political chatter and conversation? And then third, the importance of refreshing position statements, tools, resources, so that we're continuously evolving as communicators and as a field broadly. So we have 50 minutes to chat today. As Sean shared, we are going to have a 30-minute Q&A session after this. Consider it office hours. So please jot your questions down. We'll be happy to take them at that time. But let's jump into content, Niiobli. Maybe we should start with hearing from folks first.
Absolutely. And so we're going to put a question up as we go to the next slide. And there's going to be an undertone in the entire chat today about what has happened since 2020. Is this work still front and center? So I want everyone to either use your phone and scan the QR code. You can go directly to the site and enter in 2314-758. And let's answer this question. From your knowledge, has your organization, so we're not looking outwardly, we're looking inwardly, taken actionable steps to address the position statements made in 2020 regarding racial equity? So we're going to give you a few moments to answer this question. The beauty of us not knowing who you are is you can be truthful. It's anonymous. And so a lot of statements were made, a lot of energy was put out. What do you think has happened? Okay, so far we're at, about 68%. This is interesting. Let's get some more answers in here. We're almost at 300 people on the call. Okay, and this is just taking any active effort. Later on, we're going to talk about the quality or the standard of these efforts. But if anything is happening in your organization, go ahead and let us know. This data is also going to be useful to the communications network as they continue to bring resources and materials to you all to engage in this important body of work. Okay, there was one more person that went. So this is interesting. Here we have 66% that say, yes, you're taking efforts. There's about 30% that's saying somewhat, some efforts were made, but not much. We have about 4% that were unsure. And so far, the good news is only 1% says there were no tangible efforts made. And so from these statistics, I see about 160 people participated in the survey. So we're going to keep moving on, but this is good data for us to have as we move forward. So how did we get here today? Like what has happened? And I think it's important that we start off by acknowledging, just as practitioners, that there's a high level of mental fatigue and physical fatigue from living through these moments of changing discourse. What I always like to remind myself and others that we work with, though, is if as practitioners, there's mental fatigue from this body of work, imagine the level of fatigue for communities that deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis. And so I always like to start off and ground ourselves is that we are practitioners engaged in social impact work, and we're people and we have feelings too, but there's communities that don't get to enter in and out of this work. It is just their lived experience. So I just want to call that out at the beginning. I think what I also want to say is that, we started off coming out of 2020, moving from George Floyd and police brutality and the pandemic, et cetera. Then we transitioned into a presidential cycle, more social unrest coupled with mass shootings, the other, pandemic 2.0 and 3.0, most recently, the monkeypox outbreak. And I'm sure that there's something else going on. What's important, though, is that the underlying issues around the social discourse on race, equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are ever present. Those are consistent. So we're going to talk more about this later, but I just want to paint a theme that the discourse continues to change, but the underlying issues are almost consistent. The other thing I want to say, just to kind of warm us up, is that these collective experiences are not just in the discourse, they're in your lives. You have switched jobs. Some people have lost loved ones. Some of you there's anxiety and depression from working on system issues. And so all this is just to tap into your humanity and just to acknowledge how we're arriving at these discussions. So when you look at this slide and you see the images, some of it could be triggering for people. So we want to also call that out because we like to operate under the pretense of do no harm. But what I really want to convey to you, which is not what this discussion today is about, but is important, is that the best thing you can do for your racial equity work or for any of your efforts for DEI is to make sure you have an internal process, that you do some inner work. At We-Collab, we have a perspective that the system leaders best prepared to engage in this work are typically leaders who have done some form of inner work. And so if you work in an organization where your CEO or your board or your colleagues can't wrap their heads around this body of work, it more often than not is a lack of inner work that's been done. And so that's not what today's presentation is for, but I think it's important to say we have to stop trying to make DEI work an academic or evidence-based theory. It could be, and I'm sure there's researchers, maybe some of you all are working on it, but this work starts internally. And if you don't do any internal work, there's nothing I can say to you in the next 60 minutes that's going to make you walk away ready to implement a DEI equity strategy. You have to look inward and then go outward. That is the beginning of this work. That's not what we're talking about today, but it's important to name before we enter into this space. And so what we are here to talk about, though, is everyone put out a statement about racial equity and racial justice, and now what? And so, Samia, I'm going to pass it over to you to help us figure out the now what part. But thank you all for joining today.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, after George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter protest, there were a lot of organizations that put out statements of solidarity. They created value statements that were centered on equity and justice. There were a lot of financial pledges that came out of that time, and a lot of like pledges of internal work as well. And so let's chat a bit about what actually has happened in these last 2 years. All those pledges and all of those commitments, what's come of that. So first, according to a study done by the Washington Post, after 2020, after George Floyd's murder and the BLM movement, for-profit sector committed $50 billion towards racial equity efforts. $50 billion, and this is from the for-profit sector. So what's happened with that $50 billion? I want to share this chart, and I know this is a little small, so please do definitely go check out this article and get this information more closely. But in this pink box is going to be the donations that were made in a financial commitment, or sorry, in dollar contributions. So of that $4.2 billion, the breakdown is 2.1 on economic equality, 499 million in education. And interestingly, what really spurred all of this around criminal justice, only $70 million ended up going to criminal justice in particular, out of that 4.2 billion of donations. But what's even more fascinating here is if we look at this yellow section, this yellow section is $45.2 billion of that total commitment. It was actually ended up coming out in the form of loans and investments and other initiatives, which means banks that committed this and other organizations that made these commitments for loans and investments really gained to benefit profits from these pledges, right? So really the dollar contribution that was just in the form of donations is 4.2. 45.2 was really a form of being able to gain profits from the contribution itself. Since the time of this report, 37 of the 50 companies that were included in this study ended up only dispersing 1.7 billion of the 49.5 billion pledged. So we had 49.5 billion pledged. Of that, about 4.2 was in the form of donations, 45 is in the form of commitments through investments, but even out of that, only 1.9 has actually been dispersed. Again, this is from the 50 organizations that were a part of this study. So it just goes to show that in these 2 years, even though there is a major pledge, we haven't quite seen those funds trickle into the work that we really needed it to. The same story is true in the philanthropic sector as well. Bridgespan, along with PolicyLink, did a study and they found that $11.9 billion was allocated towards racial justice efforts from philanthropic organizations. And out of that, only about 1.5 billion has been dispersed. So there is still a large sum of money that needs to be dispersed and a large sum of money that needs to be figured out how it's going to be dispersed. There is some issues with this data. Predominantly in the philanthropic sector, there isn't a lot of reporting that happened of what pledges and what funds they've actually dispersed. So while there's a lot of data on what the commitment was, publicly, there haven't been a lot of updates on what ended up happening with those commitments. So the commitments were made in 2020, and there hasn't been public data after that of what happened with those funds. So this data can be a bit skewed because of that. But I think this brings up a point around communication and the narrative of your organization's work and what they're doing with your commitments that you all made. There's definitely a need for your organizations to share what happened with your pledges, what did your organizations end up doing, whether that was a financial pledge or that was a different type of commitment. There's definitely a need to kind of come back and say, hey, it's been 2 years. This is where we're at. This is what our plans are. I do have to add that there were a lot of other organizational level commitments that happened at that time that were not just financial, right? We know that organizations committed to doing diversity trainings and microaggression trainings, and a lot of that has been done. Unfortunately, there's not really a way to track that. There hasn't been any studies that have come out and said, you know, organizations committed to these internal organizational efforts, and this is what they ended up doing. So that I do want to acknowledge that there was a lot of work done at the organizational level. What that ends up looking like in community, though, I think is what's to be determined. The one additional stat that we can share around really racial injustice and what's happened since 2020 is when we look at the deaths due to law enforcement, which again, we know is what really spurred all of this in the last few years. In 2020, there were 1,132 people that were killed by police in the United States. And in 2022, as of July, there were 631 people killed. So we're pretty much on par with doing the same numbers as 2020, if not more. Really just showing that while there was a lot of conversation, there were a lot of statements and a lot of sentiment and work done, it still hasn't, both from the police injustice, which spurred this, and as far as how communities are impacted by this, we haven't quite seen that big impact yet between the promises and impact. I share all of this data to say that after all of the protests and pledging, the promising of change, the systems have not significantly changed, and that the people's day-to-day lives have not significantly changed either when it comes to racial injustice. Again, not to ignore the progress that the country has made. There's been obviously a lot more dialogue on this. There's been a lot more conversation, but there's also been a bit of a backswing as well, right? And there's also been this like burnout and you know, do we really need to keep talking about this? And is equity the right word and all of that? So we'll get into that a bit as well, but we definitely saw this uptake and we're kind of seeing this downswing a bit when it comes to the conversation around this topic as well. Niiobli, I'm going to pass over to you to talk a bit more about strategies that we can take.
Yeah, so you may be asking yourself, so what does this mean for the communicator? And so this conversation that Samia initiated was about resource allocation. And we know that those pledge amounts were unprecedented, but it was also needed because we've never made those type of investments or those bold investments as a country, you know, in decades. And so we needed that resource allocation. You can see from the data that a lot of those funds and resources did not go out the door. And so there's this disconnect between what people said they would do and then what has actually happened. And so we see the role of the communicator has the ability to close that gap. Is that based on what you do, if you keep the conversation constructive around race, equity, and strategy, we'll see more resources go out the door. And so I want to transition us to talk about how do we continue to have constructive conversations. And let me emphasize on constructive. So we at We-Collab, like we're not thought leaders or bloggers, like we're consultants. This is what we do for a living. So when we say constructive, we're talking about how do we move to action? My goal is to get someone to write more checks to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and groups of color. Like that is my goal as a company. And so when you think about the mission-driven work of your organizations, that's what it is about. Like we want more resources to go to communities to not only help solve some of these issues, but to engage around the debate. So I want to separate the discourse from problem solving work because it's two different things. And as communicators, you all get that more so than some of your programmatic friends or other folks in your organizations, but you all know the difference. And so what's interesting is that there's actually a new study out. I want to give a shout out to the independent sector. I know they worked with the Edelman Data and Intelligence Group around trust in civil society. And what there's three findings from this report that I think are really beneficial to you all. And so the first finding is that we know that trust in the nonprofit sector saw a slight downturn during the pandemic, about 3 points, but trust in philanthropy held steady. So that's one thing about this report, that an outcome. The second point I want to talk about is that we also know that there's low trust in institutions across the board. Just we're at a place in our country where the public discourse, we don't trust the government, we don't trust the private sector, but nonprofits are more trusted. So that's important. Last point in here is that we just have to figure out, the integrity and purpose that's critical to trust. So what does this mean? And so the public's belief that nonprofits, your organizations, will do the right thing is one of the reasons the sector exists. People have always thought that nonprofits and foundations help bridge, incentivize, and test new ideas. But we know that nonprofits, small businesses, community members, that's who's trusted by the majority now. And I think this is important because the public is literally, if the trust is going to be placed in nonprofits and social impact organizations and foundations, that means that that job is really on us to normalize and standardize conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. If they don't trust the government, this is going to close gaps on racial equity, but you all are trusted, then this conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion and broader social justice issues has to be stewarded. And so the most powerful question I want to ask is, what are you all going to do with that trust? It's kind of scary to think about that if the most trust in our society is with nonprofits and foundations, which means you are the best stewards of this broader discussion around equity, what are you going to do with the trust? And so there's 3 things that I think you all can start to do to help continue this conversation in your organizations, with your boards, et cetera. And I'm mindful of time, so we're going to get through these really quick because I'm also excited for the office hours for us to even dive deeper. And so the first thing you can do in your organization, if you're trying to steward trust, if you want to keep the conversation around equity and DEI ever present, is you got to turn up the heat. Just simply put, you got to turn up the heat. And turning up the heat looks like getting comfortable, making other people uncomfortable. There's too many times when we enter into an engagement with an organization and the CEO or whoever contracts us will be like, well, how do we get buy-in? And it's like buy-in, like this is mission critical work. And so as communicators, you all have to just be comfortable knowing that it's your job to make people uncomfortable talking about these topics. The other part of that is you have to direct the focus of attention on the tough issues. So you can't engage in work avoidance. And so there's so many DEI councils, roundtables, task force, book clubs. If those things are not getting to the systemic issues, then it's work avoidance. And so one of the things that Samia mentioned that I just want to call out, because this is the difference between, or it should be the difference between the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. I'm biased for nonprofit, but you can't hire your way out of this issue. You just can't go find the model minority, give them a chief equity title, and then think that that your organization is going to change. And so having the tough issues about changing how your organization operates is also part of turning up the heat. The other part of turning up the heat is surfacing conflicts. Like, where in the organization are people not ready to move this work? In our perspective, we have seen that people on the operations side do have a harder time getting engaged in this work. So if you know that from the beginning, what kind of capacity building do you do with the team that writes the checks, that looks at the letters of interest, that the guardrails of how they invest the money? So you all have to be comfortable turning up the heat. Now, I can tell you, if you want to be really provocative, what turning up the heat looks like. And so one way to turn up the heat, if you want to get real practical, is asking, what external accountability are we going to put in place for our equity commitments? Like, who on the outside is going to hold us accountable? So that's one way you can turn up the heat. Another way you can turn up the heat for those of us in the philanthropic sector, and there's ways to do this, because you got to turn it up, but you got to know when to turn it down. But the other thing you can do to turn up the heat is just start asking questions about, how does our foundation's wealth origin story reconcile with the work we do today? Like, what a powerful question. This isn't to demonize or to point fingers at the founders, but we know the history of philanthropy. We know the history of government. Like, we're at a point where if this is your first webinar, welcome, but we can't keep starting from zero. Like, that's the problem with the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, is we keep starting from zero. Like, there's been a lot of work that's been done. There's been harm that has been caused, but how does our origin story affect what we're doing today? So you got to turn up the heat, and you have to know how to regulate that heat. And we're gonna give you more strategies to do that in the office hours. But just know, full stop, if you're in the communications team and you're trying to do work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about turning up the heat. The second thing you have to do, which I think is really, really important, and I have a lot of colleagues who do direct service work, and we have discourse on this all the time, but it's really about having a conversation about the systemic issue, not just about the current event. You got to have a systems conversation. The reason you have to have a systems conversation is that a police-involved shooting is an event. It has a start and it has a stop. It breaks my heart when life is lost, but it's an event. Now, over-policing in communities of color is a systemic issue. So are your communications talking about the event, or are you talking about the systemic issue? Police-involved shooting, the murder of George Floyd, loss of life, end, prosecution, police department, people got sentenced, over. But the over-policing of communities of color is a fact, and it's part of our democracy, and it is ever present. So from a communications perspective, if you started off talking about one thing in 2020, but you didn't continue to talk about the system issue, then you dropped the ball on your job as a communicator. So we have to move into this strategy of how do we come out of the event and transition into the system issues. So if you were doing an audit of your communication practices for your organization, I would ask you, like, are you bringing voice to systemic issues, or are you just covering the headline events? And remember, this is the nonprofit philanthropic game. You don't have to do what big media does. You don't have to do what the for-profit sector does. Like, you can focus on systemic issues. When you think about however you were trained, I was go to the next slide in communications and like, what is palatable? Like, the events and the public discourse is above the iceberg. That's the stuff that everyone sees. What's below it is root cause and systemic issues. And so the question is, like, how much of your communication practices and strategies are talking about root cause and systemic issues? What's beneath? Because if you stay in the public discourse, you may not be able to move your colleagues along, because there may be someone in your organization who, when they open the Washington Post or the New York Times, they don't like what they see, and so they don't engage. But if you move to the root cause and you educate your colleagues on the systemic issues, you have a better chance of making this work sustainable. So you just have to ensure that you're talking about the system issues and then connecting it to your mission. I think the last thing that I want to talk about in this section of how to make this conversation continue, or how do you move through today, is another one I have a strong bias about, is your work optional? So, I'm going to slow down here because there's varying opinions about this, but you all came to the discussion today because you're tuned in. I'm pretty sure that you want to double down on equity if you're here. But what about your colleagues who are not here? What about, I'm just picking on my sister because you don't want to, my older sister's name is Samantha. I love Samantha to death. But if Samantha works with me and she's on the third floor and doesn't want to hear this webinar, how proximate are you getting to her, taking off your speakers and allowing her to engage in this discussion? And so it cannot continue to be optional. This is primarily for senior leaders, department directors, and C-suite staff. You just can't make it optional for everyone to come in and out of these meetings. Do you want to participate in the process, opt in or opt out? Another point, is are the capacity building and the modules and the trainings for your grantees, are those optional? There's so many times where myself and tons of equity consultants who understand this work well, we work hard and we build these modules and these trainings, and then you tell your grantees it's optional. So all the people who want to hear it opt in, and those who don't, and so we don't move capacity. And so if the work doesn't become optional, if you make it work essential, if you make it mission critical, then the conversation can happen. I'm not saying that we solve all the issues, but the equity work can't be in a silo where you're constantly preaching to the choir. And so that's why I made the comment earlier about when we start off an engagement and someone asks us, like, how do we get buy-in? My first response is this whole process is illicit to get buy-in, but leadership has to get people to the table. You know, this has to be, and I keep saying mission critical, because your equity, your DEI work shouldn't just sit in that committee or that special task force that you set up 6 months ago that has only had time to meet twice because everyone's overburdened with their regular work. If your work lives there, it's never going to like breathe and interact with the whole organization. And so I just want to recap. You know, there's this provocative question we put out there about how do we continue to have constructive conversations. You turn up the heat, you make sure it's ever present, you make sure you're talking about the systemic issues and not just the events. And then lastly, you work internally to figure out how do we get out of this work being optional and make it mandatory. So I want to transition the dialogue to another important piece that we've seen happen in the past 2 years. This whole notion of equity being partisan. So let's just full stop, like debunk that myth. Like equity is not partisan. It can't be. And let me unpack why it's not. No one political party in this country has a monopoly on causing inequity and causing harm. There's no mayor, there's no jurisdiction, there's no form of government. Inequity is equitably dispersed across our society. So to say that one party owns equity and one doesn't, you put the conversation in that big media discourse comment that I made earlier. I want you to bring it down, or actually bring equity above that. Like the crime bill, that was Democrats. Like you know, welfare reform, that was also Democrats. You know, and so it's not like we're nonpartisan. Our whole jam is about equity, because the Democrats or the Republicans or the left or the right or conservative or liberal, whatever label you subscribe to today, no one has a monopoly on this work. And so when we allow big media to make this partisan, it removes our ability to move through our work. And so you all have to be skilled enough to have like a two truths dialogue. And, you know, to me, the two truths dialogue is really about this liberty versus equity kind of paraphrase. You know, are we skillful enough to hold one interpretation about our particular observation? Because like a conservative can believe in equity and a liberal can believe in liberty. Like though these two truths can coexist with each other. And so we have to start striving in our organizations to move people past, I don't want to hear that because it sounds like it's XY political party. And I think as communication officials, there's like very tactful things we can do to get past that we're going to come to in a minute. And so I just want to go a little bit deeper here with what I'm talking about. And I am not a constitutional scholar. This is our perspective as an organization. This is what we have experienced when we've been on coaching calls, you know, the 24 organizations we work with a year in all regions of the country who are dealing with this. So what we've experienced is that big media has built this paraframe around equity work. There's an undertone of liberty that is really about the preservation of the Constitution, but their undertone is justice. Equity is about an expansion of justice, but justice is at the core. And so what this should allow a communication person to do is to figure out when you're talking about these issues around broader equity. You know, I'm not naming the domain of education or criminal justice, but a lot of the criminal justice work that has happened in the past 3-4 years was funded by conservatives. And that's because someone did some messaging work about constitutional preservation of justice, and they were able to identify with that. And I won't name who the funders were, but you can just Google and figure out that there were some unlikely bedfellows in closing some prisons down, and it like that work happened. And so we have case studies where this has been done. And so when you all get trapped in this paradigm, it's like pitting the Black preacher in the South, who is a conservative, against the justice work that he does in his community. Like, it doesn't fit. Like, he's in Georgia, he's a pastor, he has conservative beliefs, but he also is a social justice warrior because he was in the civil rights movement, et cetera. And so I just want to give you that image of like these two truths can exist. How are we leaning into this? How are we leaning into this discussion to have more discourse about it? And so, but one of my favorite orientations into this work is what Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of Policy Link, said years ago. She said this 2 decades ago. This is that equity is a growth strategy. They called it the superior growth model because it was a pathway for the future. And so in the past decade, now we're saying equity is partisan. Those two things don't match. And so I think we need to go back to the growth strategy language. We need to go back to making folks figure out like how they can use this to build capacity and just not engage. We just don't have to engage. And I told you it's false. Like there's no one party that can own this work over another one. Again, I got to keep us moving. You get in these conversations, you feel the energy, and then the clock just speeds up. And so here's another provocative question. Do we need to evolve from the term equity? Let that sit there for a second. There's so much that has happened that has caused us to have to engage with this discussion. And what I'll tell you is that the definitions is what's most important. The words will change. We will evolve our language. The question is, where's your organization right now? One of the organizations that I encourage everyone to look to is John Powell's Belonging framework. John Powell has put out a framework where people are talking about belonging, and I think it's powerful. And I've studied his target universalism framework. We use it in our work. John Powell needs his flowers now because he's helped move the conversation in the country. The provocative question I have for all of us is, when we change language, why? And who are we changing the language for? Because whenever we move from talking about equality to equity, from disparities, it's because one part of the country or part of your organization doesn't want to hear the new word. And so when it comes time to have this discussion again, when there's new frameworks and there's new theologies, is like, the words and the frameworks can change, but the definitions are the same. So who are we changing them and on behalf of what? I think that's really important. And thank you, Jessica, for dropping in John Powell's conversation with Carmen Rojas. There are tons of great conversation with John Powell that I look at. I'm on the edge of my seat because I think he's built a beautiful framework for a multiracial society. The belonging framework, I'm a fan of it. Let me put that out there. But my question is, when someone starts to attack belonging, then what else are we going to have to come out with? And I think that's a conversation that starts in our organizations. And so if you want to be vigilant about moving the conversation out of partisan politics, what are some easy steps you can do? These are things that you've seen before. ComNet has done a great job of doing webinars on these. So I just want to name them again. So the first one is data is your friend, to contextualize the narrative. And it's important because you have to make sure that there's a narrative behind the numbers. There's so many data dashboards out there. We've worked on a few, we've partnered with some great organizations, but what's the narrative behind those numbers? Who's the real person? And I love saying real person because people are like, who are real people? We're all real people. Yes, we're all real people, but when I say real person, I'm talking about someone that is not a practitioner or a colleague in the field, but they're a beneficiary of the work that your organization aims to do. Those are real people. So not practitioners and colleagues, but people who are beneficiaries of the work you aim to do. Are you telling their narrative? Now, I know because of intersectionality, we can constantly be the beneficiary of services and be promoting services. But for this one is, do you have a narrative of a real person that contextualizes the work in your organization? The other thing I think we should do to move the dialogue out of partisan politics is not to forget the class dynamics. Race and class matters. And we have to make sure that we engage the socioeconomic status, because if all the investments, I'm gonna be provocative again, but if all the investments and all the promotions go to people of color at the top of the wealth spectrum, is that advancing broader racial equity? Y'all decide. But all I'm saying is that class matters, and we have to think about where the majority of our country is in terms of wealth inequality and economic justice. And at the end of the day, what the partisan politics has done is made everyone who's not a 1%er think that we're at odds with each other. When you look at the breakdown of income and you see how that is diced, we know that we need to have a class discussion in this country too. So when you're talking about your diversity, equity, and inclusion work, make sure that you integrate class there as well. Last one, easy, which again, I assume that a lot of you know, is how are you citing bipartisan resources? This is, I think, really, really important. There are tons of entities that Wall Street, that major for-profit companies who have done deep systemic racial equity work, they go to the bipartisan sources. So an example is the US Government Accountability Office. They have a whole report infrastructure out about racial equity from a nonpartisan perspective. So if you're stuck in the nonpartisan bubble, go cite really, really smart people who are credentialed, who have written these reports from a non-bipartisan perspective. So I think you all understand where I'm going with this. And so the point that I want to make before I pass it back to Samia, who she's going to talk more about how we evolve our language, but there are things we can do not to be defeated in this work. And I know depending upon how you're situated in your organization, you need more energy to lean into this because this isn't easy work. And so we're calling out the pitfalls that you need to avoid when trying to move forward. And so because we're at time, I'm going to pass back to Samia, but I'm really, really excited for those of you who get to stay for the after hours for us to dive deeper. Samia?
Great. Thank you, Niiobli. So many good nuggets there. I want to chat a bit about evolving DEI statements and language. Again, as we stated, a lot of folks put out statements in the last couple of years that were really powerful statements, sometimes lofty, sometimes they were like knee-jerk reactions, right? So we didn't have time to really thoughtfully think about our strategies and how does my statement align. And so the conversation now is about, well, how do we evolve those statements and what does that look like? So for one, it's really important to go back and assess, what does the statement still stand true for us? Is this still how we view the issue as an organization? Perhaps you've learned more about the issues at hand. Perhaps you've learned more about how the injustices impact your stakeholders. So how do we want to talk about that now? What is our more nuanced understanding, and where do we recraft our statements based on that? And have we shifted our strategy, right? Like based on the statements that you all wrote, based on the new understanding of systems work and how racial injustice impacts no matter what type of issue you're working on, how has our strategy changed? And now do we need to go back and change our statements and refresh those? A lot of organizations that we've worked with have asked us, does the DEI statement, value, or goals that you have need to stand alone, or should it be built into the mission statement? As you all really put out those statements in the very beginning, whether it's in the form of a CEO letter, whether it's in the form of a value statement, it was very much of a standalone, this is our equity or this is our justice statement. But we can evolve from that now, right? So the question is, do we need to build that into our organizational mission statements or not? The short answer is it depends. It can be all of the above. The long answer is going to be yes. So you've heard Niiobli and I say quite a few times that DEI and equity specifically is mission critical to your organization. And if that is true, if it is mission critical to your organization, it should be a part of the mission statements of your organizations. Your equity values should be built into the values of your organization, both how you function and how you provide your services and do your work externally. So, I mean, if we really look at it, if you want to solve for food access and you want all children to have access to food, you can't really accomplish that without addressing the needs of the most vulnerable populations. If you want to address climate justice, you can't really do that without addressing the environmental needs and impact of the most vulnerable populations. Some of you may have heard in Pakistan right now, there's very, very catastrophic flooding that's happening, both because of monsoons, but also because of climate change and because of the icebergs that are melting. And And that's going to be one of the most vulnerable populations that's being impacted by climate now. And so how can you really do climate justice or food access or whatever issue you're working on without really looking at the populations that are most impacted by that issue, which is what your equity work is all about. And so really our perspective is DEI is mission critical to every organization. And if that's the case, then these statements should evolve to be a part of your organizational values and your organizational statements. And really the goal of that is, as you all know, your mission, your statements, that really ends up driving the strategy of your organization. If we could jump to the next slide here. Your statements have the power of realigning decisions. Who are we funding? How are we funding? Who are we impacting? And so really it can really impact and influence what ends up happening within your organization. So what do? We're going to review position statements and value statements. That can be, how can it be incorporated into your organization's broader mission and values? So doing an evaluation of that. And then, is it beneficial to incorporate equity statements into your mission and also have a standalone equity statement? That's also can be true. It can be a part of your statement while also having a standalone equity statement that is more specific and is more nuanced than what you can fit into an organizational statement. So the comms teams really have a big power in influencing the direction the organizations end up taking by developing these statements, by really, once you're putting it out there, once it's being put out in the organization, then decisions start getting made in that way. And so for us, the goal is your statements to drive your organization's actions. The evolution is to go from a statement to action. You know, as we've talked about in 2020, statements came out, but then we saw what actually progressed in terms of our funding and what actually progressed. And so how do we in 2022 say a statement can't just be a statement, it needs to actually lead to action. It needs to create actions within our communities and within our organizations. So talking about language, so we just talked about statements, but if we talk about language, one positive that has come out of the work in the last few years is that our language and our perspectives on equity have expanded. Definitely the more conversations that we've had, we've really expanded our understanding. One example is going to be on gender identity. For many of you, as you know, in the last few years, we've started using pronouns. We introduce ourselves with pronouns. And so this just idea of gender identity has really expanded our consciousness. And now the question is, well, how does that impact the work that we do? So one example, we've been working with a client that's in the education sector, and they brought up the fact that a lot of their resources say boys and girls, right? Like boys and girls do X, Y, Z. And the question was, well, we can change this one document, but how do we have an organizational wide conversation about what our opinion is on this and how we want this to influence and impact the rest of our resources and anything else new that we're creating here? So the really takeaway here is that these conversations will come up. Do we use capitalizations when we're talking about different races and ethnicities? Is it capital B? Is it lowercase b? Is it African American? Is it Black? Is it Native Indigenous? Is it Native American? There are some right and wrong scenarios there, and you can find that insight on the Com Network DEI website. We definitely have a perspective there, but there's also some just gray area when it comes to that. And so the important component of this is taking the time to sit as an organization and to really think through, where do we stand on this? What is our stance? Because this will come up over and over, and there should be some kind of style guide, language guide that's constantly being updated to include this information into it. So in that vein, a quick shout out that comnetworkdei.org is getting a refresh. We are currently working with the Communications Network to review the whole website, look at the language, look at the tools, look at the glossary, and really figure out, this came out 2 years ago now. What has evolved since then? And where do we need to make updates on the guidance that we're providing to you all in the field as well? So I'm giving you all a shout out that and some insider information that there will be a refresh coming in the coming months. So please do turn to that for new guidance and for new recommendations as well. So with that, let's close out with a couple of quick questions for you all. We want to do another poll here. We talked about, the influence that communicators have and the influence that you all have as a team. So I'd love for you to pop into the Slido again and take a poll. In your perspective, who has the power within the organization to initiate this body of work? Give us what you think on who that is and how your decisions are driven. Great. Looks like we're popping back and forth between executive team and the staff.
Yeah, this is interesting. So earlier when we were talking about turning up the heat, maybe the people that we direct the heat towards is the executive team in this case. Well, this is great. And thank you all so much for the comments in the chat. So many good things and nuggets of wisdom there.
Absolutely.
Great.
All right, Niiobli, let's close us out in these last 3 minutes.
So there's a few things, that I want to reflect on. So one is that this work cannot be siloed, and this is the work that can't wait. I've always been really surprised by the nonprofit and the social good sector that if a new mandate comes down to expand to a new area, all of a sudden people move really, really quickly. When anyone talks about doing the DEI work, things almost start to go in slow motion. And it takes so much process and rigor, which rigor is important, but the work shouldn't get lost in process. And so one of the things I want to leave us with is, if 2020 was a reactive year, then 2020 and beyond is a reflection of who's being proactive. And so where do you want to stand when this webinar happens in 2023? Like, will you still be saying that not much didn't happen? Will you not be happy with the quality of the work? I'm looking at the chat now, and there's ways to influence your board. There's so many strategies you can deploy, but it has to be actionable. It actually has to be written down. You just can't go through the process. Like, what are the aspirations for the goal is a great question you should be asking yourself. But even more importantly, like, what is emergent? Like, what are you not thinking about? What hasn't come up? Because what we didn't talk about today is that all of this DEI or equity work is a reflection of internal dynamics, what is happening in the organization and with whom, and then what do you do externally as your evidence? And so those are two completely different buckets of work. You could spend all your time on the internal dynamics, just getting X team member to want to play with you in the sandbox. Or you can spend all your time on the external messaging and what you put out to the world and how you align with your constituents. And so when Samia was talking about what language works best, I always like to point outward. Like, who do we serve? What language works best for them? And then what's the capacity we do internally to get people ready to execute on that language? And so we're time blocked with here. I want to thank everyone for your time and attention and for leaning in. We're going to drop our emails here. If you cannot come to the office hours, we're easily accessible to chat. This is what we do every day, all day. It's a pleasure. I'm a huge fan of the Communication Network, huge fan in general of communication professionals. We're not communication people, we're equity people. But shout out to all the work you all do, just holding space and keeping this conversation active.